you can't get too high, you can't get too low. You just got to be steady if you're going to be involved in this work.
Just have to be. It's kind of like podcasting. You just got to be steady with it.
That's right. It really is. You have a podcast episode that will go off. You're like, oh, this is amazing. This is going to go from glory to glory. And then the next week, it's like, oh, okay. Well, they didn't like that. They didn't like that topic. But if you maintain it over time, it will grow. And it's the same thing with church planning.
Welcome to the Christian Leader Made Simple podcast. I really hope this episode helps you learn and master the skills you need to grow your leadership effectiveness and enjoyment. Be sure to hit the subscribe button to get notified as soon as I post a new session so you don't miss a single episode. I'd also greatly appreciate any reviews, likes, and shares that you can give me. It just helps me extend my reach to more people. So leaders, I know just how frustrating it can feel when you're in the weeds of work or ministry and life is chaotic, you're struggling to feel effective, and you're just not enjoying leadership as much as you could be. And so to help you, after many years of leadership and executive coaching, I've developed a framework called the Christian Leader Blueprint that'll guide you to find clarity in your life and leadership. It'll help you gain a better rhythm of life. It'll help you see yourself more clearly, to leverage your strengths, and you'll produce more productive relationships. It's a step-by-step guide to leadership transformation. And I have that in 2 formats now. I have a free short guide that you can find on ryanfranklin.org, and I have a book, The Christian Leader Blueprint. And you can find that in any format, including an audiobook, wherever you buy your books. I have a few more things on my website that you may be interested in, so just head on over to ryanfranklin.org and check it all out. And now, let's get to our session.
On the show today, we have Greg Hackathorn. You may know him as the host of a very popular podcast, the Hacka Podcast. Greg has served in full-time ministry at the Pentecostals of Sydney and Sydney, Australia for over 15 years. And he is the campus pastor of a new church plant on the Central Coast. He's married to Stephanie and has 2 beautiful girls, Ava and Reagan, with Levi on the way. So, Greg, welcome to the Christian Leader Made Simple podcast.
It's so good to be on. It's an absolute blessing. So many of our leadership team and those who are aspiring leaders here at POS listen to the podcast, share it around, and I'm excited to be part of the conversation and what we're doing here today through your great show.
Absolutely, Greg. Well, I appreciate you coming on. We first met, officially met you in June of this year when I came to Australia to do the leadership retreat for the leaders. But I've known you quite a while, I guess, from a distance through your podcast. I've listened to the Hacka Podcast for quite some time. It's tremendous podcast, and you've done a really good job in producing a great podcast that really has grown significantly. And I looked it up just yesterday on Listen Notes, and it's actually it's in the top 1.5% of all podcasts globally, which is pretty large. So what motivated you to start that podcast, and how did you grow it to be such a popular podcast?
Well, I've always loved podcasts. I've listened to podcasts for years. I don't even know how many years now, and a large variety of podcasts. I listen to podcasts on running, podcasts on leadership, on history. Like right now, I'm currently listening to I don't know if you've heard of the Rest is History podcast. I've been listening to like a 9-part series on the French Revolution. I'm not realizing like how much I didn't know about that. So I just love podcasts, and I had thought about doing it. I had run a blog for a number of years, and so I've enjoyed writing. But I was like, well, let's give this a go. So I started recording in, I believe it was June of 2021. I did my first few recordings, and I looked up, how to launch it. You should have a couple, 2 to 3 recorded before you start, and so on.
Yeah.
And so I had recorded a couple, and then as fortune would have it, that I think it was like 2 weeks after I started my first recordings. I hadn't launched yet. I had talked about launching it. I think I posted on my page or whatever, my Facebook page and Instagram. Hadn't officially launched yet. And then we went into a 4-month lockdown here in Sydney. And it was sort of like the very beginning of it. It gave me an opportunity to focus on it, to get it started. And, start off as a weekly show, and it's developed over time. But, just have a passion for podcasts. I saw that I was inspired by the Restorationist by Adam Shaw. He has a great podcast, and I love his, and I found value in it. And I thought, well, this is a great area where we can minister to people during the week and give them an opportunity to not only be ministered to, but be entertained by the conversation. I'm not always praying while I'm listening to these conversations. Sometimes I'm driving, doing work around the house, and it's just entertainment value that's clean. And I'm going to learn from it as well. So that was kind of the genesis of it. That's how I got into it. And then over time, it's just grown into the thing. The reason I call it the Hacka Podcast is there's this podcaster, ex-Navy SEAL Jocko Willink. He has a very popular podcast, and it's called the Jocko Podcast, which is his nickname. And I was like, that's a cool name. And it's really kind of based around his point of view, like the subjects that he talks about are things that are interesting to him. And I was like, well, I think this is what we're going to do. It's going to be apostolic, but we're going to have conversations about things that are interesting to me, whether it's media, whether it's spiritual warfare, whether it's leadership. If it's just a conversation with my brother, I've done that. My wife, about health, different things like that. So, and that people have commented, it's like, oh, it's such a wide variety of topics you cover. And it's like, well, yeah, that's kind of the point. I don't want to be pigeonholed, and I like people that have a bit of variety in the conversations that we have on the pod.
I think that's one reason why I really enjoy it, is because it's such a wide range of topics. Now, I have to admit, I don't listen to every topic, but you do have a wide range. I mean, you may have discipleship, or you may have a person's story. You recently had I forget his name, but a guy from Vietnam, and I happen to love Vietnam and enjoyed that one very much. But just a wide range of things that really, that I have personally connected to and have enjoyed the podcast for a couple of years now.
Yeah, there's one thing that I saw right at the beginning. Again, like I said, I listened to a lot of podcasts, and I'd listened to this guy, and he said, if you are able to record and produce 20 episodes, so if you get up to 20, that'll give you a good gauge as to whether you should continue, if there's going to be any sort of listenership. And he also said that if you actually produce 20 of them, you're automatically in the top 5% of podcasts, because everyone quits. We all have this idea, we're excited about it, and then it's like, oh, well, I don't have the time, or you run out of things to talk about. You think you have, everyone thinks it's so easy until the mic's in your face, and it's like, oh, I don't know if I still have something to say now that there's a microphone there.
Yeah, it is tough. One of the worst things about it for me is to hit record. I hate hitting record. I just told you that before we hit record on this one. That is one of the worst things about it. Then the second worst thing about it is just the grind. I mean, you did it for week in, week out, every single week for a long time, for years. I switched to every other week about a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago now. But it is, even every other week is still a grind. It's amazing how quick those weeks come by. And, I'm, for sake of the audience, I want to stay consistent. There's times where I may choose to postpone a session and not do it consistently, but for the most part, I try to be as consistent as possible if my life can stay healthy with it as well. So I'm sure you do the same.
Yeah, I think that's important. And we did a weekly episode for 3 years, and I was pretty proud of that. It took a lot of work, but at the beginning, as I mentioned, I'm in lockdown, so it's quite easy to do one every week. At that point, I was, an administrator at the church. Church was growing, but I didn't have so many tasks. And over the last few years, I've gained a few more responsibilities. And so I think when you were with us in June, I'd been thinking about it for a number of months, about transitioning from one every week to one every 2 weeks. And just having a conversation with you was kind of like, okay, yeah, I think I'm going to take this leap. And it's a challenge. I'm a numbers guy, always have been. Doesn't matter if it's a podcast, a YouTube channel, if it's church attendance, if it's giving. I love numbers. I've since I was a kid. And so it's difficult to see the numbers change a little bit because of the lack of frequency with the episodes. But as you said, you got to look after yourself, and we'll probably look at that about a little bit later in this conversation. But it's important to in what you're doing to keep the main thing the main thing. Keep what is the main priority in your life. This is a great opportunity for me to be a blessing to others, but it's not my highest priority. So
look at you throwing out TF Tenney quotes. Keep the main thing the main thing. That's a phenomenal quote that I hear so often. Such a great quote. Well, before we move off the topic of podcasts, I'm just curious, has there been any of maybe favorite or most impactful moments with hosting the podcast, or any guest or topic that stands out?
Well, there's been a few when this question is asked to me. Obviously, the most impactful one was one by Dr. Vonnie Marshall when I had her on the podcast. She was visiting Australia, and I interviewed her just for a normal interview, like I did with you a couple of weeks ago, where we just get into the individual and different topics that they are might be proficient in. And that went really well. And towards the end of it, we had gotten into mental health a little bit, and I had some questions about the brain, and I think it piqued her interest. She's a very insightful lady, and she's like, "Oh, did you want to do after we press stop recording?" She's like, "Did you just want to do a full recording just on mental health?" I said, "I think that would be good. There's a lot of questions about it. It was just on the back end of the lockdowns, and so there's significant issues that people have been facing, and so we recorded that, and that one really changed the podcast. That was our first episode that got quite big, and that brought in a lot of new listeners. So that one would definitely be a big one. For me personally,
you had some Instagram that had went viral with some of that episode, right?
Yeah. So with that one, I normally put out a reel or two at the conclusion of each episode to promote it, because the goal is to get them to listen to the long form. The Instagram's there just to supplement the long form, because but anyway, I'd put out a couple, and it hadn't really taken much root. And then like maybe a month later, I think it was in the States actually, and I put out a reel of her talking about, it was something to do with the brain, and I can't quite remember exactly that one, but it had over 1 million views, and that just was crazy. Like I'd never experienced anything like that. And since then, we've had a number of reels go viral. One of hers in particular, in a later episode when we were talking about forgiveness, almost everyone's seen that. It was over 4 million views, and then other people start sharing it, and they're getting heaps of views. And I've had people react to it, like just people who create their own content. And so that was pretty amazing to see. But yeah, she's awesome, and she puts out amazing content, and I'm just privileged to capture it and share it with everybody else. But for me personally, one of the highlights, especially given his passing this year, was my interview of Harold Hoffman. It was a huge blessing to our church here in Sydney for a number of years, and to my family in particular. He's a wonderful man of God, and I'll always count that as a true honor that I was able to sit down with him for an hour and just talk about his life and his passion for the Word of God and study. And then I've had other ones with Raymond Woodward, who love that man, and I've loved his preaching for over a decade now, and to be able to sit down with him for an hour and talk about different things, it's just so blessed. So I'm hoping to have another one with him in the future. Yeah, there's been a number of them. Those, I guess, would be the ones that really stood out.
Yeah, that's one of the things that has been such a blessing with my podcast, is just being able to sit down with people that I normally wouldn't have the opportunity to, and just sit down, have an hour conversation with them, record it, and just dig into their lives a little bit. And that is a neat experience. So
yeah, one of the cool, just before we move on, one of the cool things that I really want to do through my podcast, and it's why I started the way I do, is I like sharing their life with people. Like, we look up to these leaders, we look up to these great men and women of God, and almost seems unattainable because we look at them on the platform, or we look at the church that they started and the ministries that they've had. And one of the things I love being able to do on the podcast is to sort of get into their past. I remember I had a memory of Brother Woodward being a music director, and so he's done so many podcasts. We had gotten into his backstory, and I'd heard him do a few, and he kind of went into his normal routine of sharing a little bit about his backstory. And then I threw the musician thing at him, or worship leader, and he was so taken aback. It was a great moment, and he shared some funny stuff about that in his past. But those are some cool things. I got to talk to Brother Gleason about him being in a quartet after Bible school. He traveled and was in a traveling quartet. I knew that because I grew up in the Kansas City area where he pastored.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so like cool things like that people don't really know about these individuals.
Yeah.
I love being able to share that.
Yeah. Well, you have journeyed you grew up in the U.S., but you've journeyed to Sydney somehow, some way. It's pretty interesting, the story, that the little bit of the story that I've heard of it. And we've personally talked about it a little bit. But can you share the story of what drew you to settle down in Australia?
Well, in a word, Stephanie. So basically, we went to Bible school together. I went to, back in the day when it was still Gateway College of Evangelism. I'm a Missouri District boy, grew up in the Missouri District, and so went to Bible school there in Hazelwood. Before it's all beautiful. So you grew up, now.
Were you born in Hazelwood and grew up in Hazelwood?
No, I grew up in the Kansas City area. So I grew up, Brother Gleason pastored in the area. I went to a different church in Liberty, Missouri, but that's where I grew up. So I was in the Missouri District my whole upbringing, and went to Bible school there, obviously, because Gateway was, at that point, it was run by the Missouri District. They funded it and so on. And obviously it's way better than IBC and CLC. So I'm just kidding. Just getting controversial, But Steph just happened to go to school there. She actually wanted to go to IBC. Hopefully none of the alumni are listening. But Brother Trimble, who was a family friend, pastored in the area, in the St. Louis area. And so her mom felt more comfortable with her moving country and going to school in the St. Louis area, which is where Gateway was. And we met there, started dating, and one thing led to another. Felt like needed to come to Australia at least for a year to meet her family, the people who cared about her, that poured into her life. And I moved Christmas Eve 2008. The plan was to be back in the U.S. After we got married, and God had other plans for us. And the doors really opened up in Australia as soon as we got here. My pastor, who you've been able to interview as well, Brother Stan Harvey, he was the assistant pastor when I first moved here. He is, yeah. And I've been blessed to be connected with him and be mentored by him. But he was assistant pastor at that time and administrator. And I came in, moved in to sort of just help him. And in the meantime, within 6 months, he was elected as senior pastor of the church. So the administrator role opened up here, and I transitioned into that role, and I've been doing that, sort of expanded it and so on, but for the last 15 years.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask you about that, but before we do that, I want to ask you, is there anything about the U.S., the States, that you miss that maybe is a little different in Australia?
I would say, there's quite a number of things. The church culture in America, because it's so big. Our church here, we have a great church here, but it is a bit smaller. So it doesn't have the same sort of, you don't have, the big youth conventions and then the big youth congress and the culture of going out to eat after service, which, grew up doing that. And here, everything's closed by the time we get out of evening service. We all end up going to Macca's or McDonald's, as Americans would call it. But I think the church culture is probably the number one thing that I miss.
Yeah.
But I mean, we're developing that here. So.
Yeah, you guys have a tremendous group of ministers there. When I was there, one thing that I noticed that, it just felt like that the ministers in that leadership retreat were just soaking up every word that I would say. They were very receptive to growth and, just leaning into developing themselves. And that was a really encouraging time for me, for sure.
Yeah, the Australian leadership and the Australian church in general are great listeners. Like, if you come here and preach and you're used to the call and response that you normally get, sometimes you might feel a little bit defeated until you make the altar call, and then the altar's full because they've been listening, taking in what you're sharing. Here at POS, we have a bit more of a call response environment because of the nature of our pastors preaching. But for the most part in Australia, they're very good, active listening to what you have to share. And also, you have to remember that we don't get that many guest ministry because we are so far away. So whenever we do have guest ministry, we try and prioritize that, make sure that we're not wasting this opportunity to learn something new. Obviously, you can watch stuff online, but it's different if it's in person and that person's there with you.
So back to your church administration role, what led you to pursue that role? Was it just an opportunity that opened up, or was there more to that? I know that you're not just an admin kind of a guy. You're also a very creative guy as well. And so how does that role? This is a two-part question. Maybe too much of a question. I can repeat this if necessary. But how does that how can you express your creative side and your logical side, even in the midst of this church administrator role?
Yeah, so the administrative role just sort of opened up, and it was an opportunity to be involved in the kingdom. And I was, 20 years old. I still can't believe they let me do it. Looking back, I was like, I don't know if I would have, but they trusted me, and they gave me that opportunity. And really, that's what it was. There was an opportunity, and I wanted to be involved in the kingdom, doing whatever I could. Coming out of Bible school, feeling a call to preach, feeling a call to see the kingdom grow. So that really was the impetus behind it. And then I've gained skills over time. The media stuff was something that I just saw as something that was important for church growth. Like, my focus is church growth. As the administrator, my pastor, that's his focus as well. And so, I fall in alignment with him. And if media is a way that we can grow the church, and I want to be into that. I joke that I'm not very creative. Every person who talks to me is like, "Oh no, you are a creative." It's like, no, I've seen creatives. they're out there. I'm more of a pragmatist, and I think we actually had this conversation when you were here. This is the exact conversation. But
you were doing so many things, and and you were capable of doing so many things well, from technical to teaching to anything you were asked or needed to do, you did, and did it well.
Yeah, my pastor had a conversation with me when I was young, and I also get this a bit from my mother-in-law, Gina Gretsch, who's the assistant pastor here in Sydney, and she's had a tremendous impact on my life. But basically, my view is I'm here to serve. So whatever I can do to help, and if this is an area of weakness, I want to try and fill that void as best as I can. The pulpit doesn't open up to you straight away, and it shouldn't. You should be able to provide value outside of the pulpit, especially if you're a young leader, a young minister. And so I kind of learned that stuff along the way. I'm still able to do that. At some point, we'll probably have younger people who are much better, more proficient. They're going to make it look a lot better. But if you're surrounded by people who don't know how to do those sorts of things, and I have the willingness to learn, then it's incumbent on me to go ahead and do that.
Absolutely. So, Greg, you're also planning a daughter work, and I don't know what the local city is. Central Coast the local city, or is Central Coast the coast?
Yeah, so Central Coast is the region. The actual local city is Gosford. That's the main area. It's about 170,000 people. But there's a whole collection of towns. No church. And there's a whole collection of towns that make up the Central Coast. That's about 330,000 people. So Gosford's the main hub, and that's really where our plant is located. But the intention is to try and reach the entire Central Coast.
Yeah, so I want to hear a little bit about your experience in church planning. What are some of the challenges you faced, and then maybe what are some of the rewarding things you've had along the way?
Well, church planning is pretty much what every church planner tells you it is. It's a lot of hard work. You can try and approach it different ways. Like we used the method that North American Missions uses, which is called the launch method. Now it's a little bit different for us because we're a daughter church, so we're not having to raise our own funds, which is a blessing, and we've got the mother church behind us. So that is a huge blessing. But yeah, we just felt there's never been an apostolic church in this region. Australia.
That's amazing to me. 170,000 people and no apostolic church.
Yeah, I think it's I don't know if it's forgotten, but it's about an hour outside of Sydney. Drivable if you want to attend a church in Sydney. We have a church up on the northern beaches, which is probably about 30 minutes away from where we planted. So people could technically go to a church there, but
still a long drive.
It's still a long drive. Yeah, definitely. And for them,
and you guys drive on the wrong side of the road too, so that's
makes it a bit longer.
Makes it a little bit harder.
But like there's natural geographic things that sort of keep people from wanting to come back down to Sydney from the Central Coast. And, it's more relaxing up there. It's not the big city. So that's a reason why there should be a church plant up there just for them. And, the church in Australia, we have a huge challenge because it isn't a big nation as far as population goes. It's 26 million people. And I'm not sure if Pastor covered this when he was on your podcast, but like a crazy amount of the percentage of the population are located in big cities. And so, if you look in the U.S., the UPCI in the U.S., it's very difficult to grow churches in large cities just because of the way lifestyle is affected. It's hard to create community because everyone's working different shifts and so on and so forth. The busyness of life. You don't see large churches in big cities, even in the States, even though there are large churches in the States. So that's a challenge for us to try and grow in a metro environment. And then from there, we reach out to the more rural areas. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say Gosford Central Coast is rural, but in the context of Sydney, it kind of is.
Right.
And so some of the this is the yin and yang of church planning, or the funny thing is, I think it was like 3 weeks ago. It's the middle of winter. We're having our service at 5 p.m. So winter in Australia, we're the inverse of you guys,
heat
right?
of the summer in the U.S., winter in Australia.
That's right. And we had a service where I think there was a ladies' camp going on, so a number of our normal people weren't able to come. We still had service, and this was like 2-3 weeks ago. We've had growth throughout the year, averaging in the 20s for the local area, which is this is our first year. That's huge, especially in Australia. It's
absolutely
quite big. I mean, Australia is very similar to Europe in the way that they view religion and that sort of thing. And so we go up there. We have a core team from POS that helps, and they've been amazing. But on this Sunday, it was just my family and one other young lady who was there to help us from Sydney. And then a number of the people in Central Coast were away sick or something was going on. We had 17 people. And I'm just like, man, what is going on? And then the very next week, my wife's away ministering in New Zealand at a ladies' camp. We still have service. We get together a music team. She's carrying our music department, right? She's phenomenal. She's the music director at POS, and then she does it at POCC as well. But she's away, so I'm like, okay, well, this is going to be a challenging week. Get there, and we had our highest number of attendees from the Central Coast region. The very next week, we had over 30 for the first time. We'd never broken 30 from the Central Coast. So that's church planting, right? One week, it's like, what are we doing? The next week is like, oh, wow.
And most of the time, there's no explanation for it.
No.
It just happens.
No. It just happens. And you know this from your days being involved in church planning. You can't get too high. You can't get too low. You just got to be steady if you're going to be involved in this work.
Just have to be. It's kind of like podcasting. You just got to be steady with it.
That's right. It really is. You have a podcast episode that will go off. You're like, oh, this is amazing. This is going to go from glory to glory. And then the next week, it's like, oh, okay. Well, they didn't like that. They didn't like that topic. But, if you maintain it over time, it will grow. And it's the same thing with church planning. It's the same thing with anything, really.
So before we continue on with the podcast, this episode is brought to you by Christian Leader Community Coaching. Are you a Christian leader experiencing low productivity or a chaotic lifestyle? And maybe you're overwhelmed and just unsure of what it's going to take to create growth in your life. And so I want to introduce to you our Christian Leader Community Coaching Program. Through our step-by-step framework, you're going to discover a better rhythm of life. You'll see yourself more clearly, leverage your strengths, and build more productive relationships. With our full archive of courses, our supportive community of peers, a powerful leadership assessment to get you quickly focused. We also have live community coaching and so much more. And I've personally seen its huge impact with leaders from all over the world, experiencing laser-focused growth in their lives. And now, through this community, this experience is open to you. And we want to help you implement these simple frameworks and then celebrate with you as you experience significant results in your life. Don't wait any longer. Go to ryanfranklin.org and join the Christian Leader Community Coaching today. And I look forward to seeing you inside the community. Now back to our podcast.
Is there any particular points of maybe a rewarding things that you have experienced along the way? I know you're only a year into it, but what's been rewarding to you?
There was a family. He's an avid listener to my podcast. They're all so proud of it, the people who are part of the church there. But Paolo, him and his family were located on the Central Coast. He had moved over from the Philippines. Originally was in Sydney for a little bit, and then had to move up there. It's an easier way of life, more affordable.
Yeah.
And they hadn't been able to attend church just because of where he lived. And he heard about us through his cousins who attend the church in Brisbane. And he just joined us on a Wednesday night, and he goes, I'm going to be part of this church. I'm so excited. And he hasn't missed since, and that's an amazing story, because, where would his faith journey be without us being able to start a work there? And then obviously we've had a number of people baptized and born again. And I could go through a listing off people, but it's just so rewarding seeing lives changed and seeing an area that didn't have an opportunity. When we first looked at planning, I was watching the launch conference that North American Missions does. It's phenomenal. They make everything available for free online. Just an incredible, North American Missions is incredible. Anyway, I think it was Brother Sistrunk was preaching, and he talked about, he's planted a number of churches, but he talked about one church in particular that he planted, and he said they were meeting in like the back room of a bank. And I think there was like 3 or 4 of them there. And there's a statement he made. He said, we were very small, but the reality is that if anyone in that area wanted to hear the gospel, they wanted to hear the message, the apostolic message, they had an opportunity that night because we were there. And that's incredible for me. It's like anyone
that is incredible
within 30 minutes of where we've planted, on a Sunday at 5 p.m., they can come and hear the apostolic message simply because we're there.
Yeah. And there's individuals that will, along the way, as you go, even now, but along the way as you go, that will now have the opportunity to experience an apostolic church and to experience Christ in a way that they likely never have or would had you not planted that church. So tremendous thing that you're doing there. Hats off to you, because I know how hard it is.
Yeah, I know you do. And thank you for that. And, that's why you do it, right? It's for the lives that are changed and for the stories. And each person has their own story. Just last week, just a couple weeks ago, we were able to baptize a mother and a son. We just celebrated 1 year from going weekly services. Last Sunday, 2 people received the Holy Spirit for the first time. And so stuff like this just really propels you forward, because, it's hard work, but seeing the lives changed and impacted is just incredible.
That is tremendous. So, Greg, you're an administrator, you're a church planner, you're a podcaster, you're a family man with a kid on the way as well. I have 2 kids and a son on the way. Balancing all of that has to be quite challenging for you. So how do you manage your time, make sure that you stay focused on the most important things in your life?
I think we touched on it a little bit. I think, coming to a point where you realize what you can do, what you can't do. One of the things that I've learned from my pastor, who is phenomenal at this, is he's really good at delegating. He's really good at building the team around him. And so, I may be the one that I'm wearing the hats. I might be the person who's the leader per se, but I'm not doing it by myself. I've got other people that are doing different things. Like just before this call started, I got a text message from one of the ministers who's helping out at POCC, and she was checking in on whether one of the ladies had a Bible study and if I'd be happy for her to go ahead and start one. So it's like, I don't have to be the one teaching every single Bible study. I don't have to be the one who's doing every house visit. I don't have to be across absolutely everything. I have to learn to invest in other people. And that's something that you teach quite well within your blueprint, is learning how to lead others, learning how to delegate. And that's something that I've had to learn, something I've had to do, is know that I can't. And I, as someone who has done all of the little tasks over the years, like I pretty much built out a lot of the stuff that helps run Pentecostals of Sydney. And then seeing some of those things change, I have to be willing to accept that, because it's like, well, I can't be doing it all anymore. Somebody else has to do it. Somebody else has to have their input, right?
We pretty much do it a little different. Yeah. And it may not feel like it's even as good sometimes, but you still have to release those things if you're going to move on to different things. I wouldn't say better. I would just say different.
Yeah, exactly. And especially if your responsibilities are increasing, you've got to figure out a way that you can release some of the things that aren't as important, the things that you don't necessarily have to do, and trust others to be able to do that. So that's one of the main things. Another thing is my wife has done a good job of helping me create boundaries in my life when it comes to family time, when it comes to the evenings. I don't have my computer out hardly ever. If the girls have come home from school, I'm spending time with them and giving them an opportunity to spend time with their dad before I'm doing other ministry tasks or editing an episode or whatnot. So, trying to make sure that I'm doing that after they go to bed, and then also keep bearing in mind that my wife deserves my time as well. So I've got to make sure that I'm not doing that every single night to where our relationship is negatively impacted. So keeping those things in mind, ensuring that you're not so singularly driven by reaching souls at any cost that you're having a negative impact on your family. And then what I briefly mentioned earlier, when you realizing that the podcast was something that has been a blessing and will continue to be a blessing to people, but it's not my main priority. And so if I'm not doing an episode every single week, I've got to be okay with that. I've got to be okay with maybe the listenership drops a little bit. Am I going to be okay with that? Well, if it means that I've got more time with my family, if it means that I'm able to prepare that message for POCC on Sunday, then I've got to be okay with that. I've got to understand, okay, this is the priority in my life, and these are the things that I've got to give my time to, and keeping those in the right order.
Yeah, and I asked that question specifically because that's one thing I admire about you, is that it seems as though you have though you're so busy and though you have your hands in a lot of really good ministry things, it seems that you have a good balance of those priorities, and that's a wonderful thing. So we've talked about your passions a little bit, and I know that maximizing potential with people and helping people pursue their purpose, that's very important to you, even as you mentioned, delegating and putting people in places that they need to go to be used in the kingdom. You've voiced your passion for that. What does that look like in real life for you? How do you help others discover and live out their God-given potential?
Well, I think it's in many different ways. Like, if it's within the community we've built on the Central Coast, it would be through teaching and preaching up there. If it's here at POS, it's learning to delegate and involve people in kingdom work. Trying to continually communicate, as I said earlier, that ministry is not just about a pulpit. It's not even just about a Bible study, even those things are probably highly important. Not probably, they are highly important. Bible studies are huge. But, there's other aspects of ministry that help the church go, and finding your place, finding an area where you can serve. That's something I really try to stress. And I use the podcast to do that. Really try to get people on that understand that's the focus, to give people an opportunity. And that's why I have people from all different types of ministry backgrounds. Got someone like Dr. Marshall, who has been able to use her education to help people in different ways. Sister Jo Strand, Dr. Jo Strand, where she's been able to minister, and she's not even credentialed. I didn't know that. and she's not even a credentialed minister, but yet she helps thousands of people, people with a background in media, trying to highlight these different areas where you can be of service, where you can impact the kingdom in a way that goes far beyond you. And one person I love to highlight that's part of POS, and she went to school. Her name's Mai. She went to school for graphic design, had attended our church for years. And someone mentioned that to me. I'd been struggling my way through creating designs and social media stuff at POS for years. And someone highlighted to me this girl who's gone to school for it. And I was like, well, let's see if we can get her on board. So I started talking to her, and had her doing like a post a week, and then started doing another post. And then she had this idea of doing testimony videos every week, sharing a testimony on the POS Facebook page. And that could be, someone holding a phone. It could be a testimony shared in service. But anyway, long story short, she now runs our social media. And when she took over our Facebook page, the POS Facebook page, we had about 12,000 followers. We have over 120,000 followers now because of
her. Goodness.
Exactly. And it's because of her willingness to put her talent to work in the kingdom of God, and her willingness to continue to grow and see areas that she can share the gospel. That's one young lady, and she's had such a tremendous impact, impacted hundreds of thousands. We've had videos that have had millions of views, and they've honestly had a spiritual benefit to people. Now, does that mean they all come to POS? No, but there is a seed that's being planted, right? And that's because she was willing to do it. I love highlighting her story. I think really just encouraging people to see beyond what they're currently doing, and say, hey, this is something this is an area you can be involved in now. You don't have to get a degree to help out in this area, and it's going to make a big impact in the kingdom if we focus it in the right direction.
Well, you may have already answered this next question with what you just said, but do you have anything to add for someone who may be struggling to find direction or purpose in their life? If they're really struggling with that, anything to add to help them?
Yeah, well, I think obviously you need to work on your spiritual disciplines and allow God to have more control of your life, sort of lead you and guide you. But just look for areas of need within the church. You could maybe in a small church. There's plenty of areas of need within a small church. You may be in a large church. In a large church, there's going to be areas of need where you can serve.
Well, one thing that you said at the beginning of this podcast was that you filled a need as an administrator in that church. I'm sure along the way you filled a lot of needs just because they were a need and somebody had to do them. You didn't necessarily like everything you were doing, but you filled that need. And so I love that advice. That's tremendous. What is the need, and how can I put my giftings and my time and energy into that need? Lean into that, even if it's energy draining, or even if you know that you're not going to do it forever.
Yeah, for sure. And I don't know many people that are called to be a camera operator, or called to be necessarily a photographer, or called to be an usher. I don't know many people that responded to the call of God to be an usher, right? Like all the areas. I wasn't called to be an administrator. I was called to be a preacher.
There are some out there.
There are.
Yeah.
For sure. But for many of us that sit on the sideline, trying to address the question that you had, people sitting on the sideline waiting for this purpose to just drop in their lap. I felt called to preach at the age of 16, called to Bible school, and planted a church at 34? I was 34 years old. So that's a big gap, right? That's 18 years. And what was I going to do for those 18 years? Just sit around and wait for God to call me to plant a church? Or you can use that time to help the kingdom where you're at and learn things along the way. There's so many things that I've learned over the last 18 years that has helped me in this process.
That will help you plant that church.
Of course. So always being willing to do what is needed, I think is very valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. So, looking ahead for you and your ministry, what are some of your future goals for your ministry, your podcast? How do you see those platforms sort of evolving in the future?
I guess my goal is just to continue to do what I'm doing, to help where I can, to see the church grow. In Sydney, that's one of my main focuses, but also in Gosford on the Central Coast, I want to continue to see lives impacted. I want to continue to see growth take place. And one of the things that I've had to really remind myself in this church planning phase is that growth looks different. It doesn't necessarily have to be numerical growth. It could be spiritual growth. But my passion is to see people grow. As I continue to grow, I want to see others grow and give them an opportunity for growth. So that's one of the main goals. And of course, I'm able to do that through the podcast as well. I don't have any sort of numerical goals anymore for the podcast. I'll continue to do it as long as I feel, God's leading me to do it. But my main goal is just to continue to inspire and encourage others through whatever platform I have, whether that's the podcast, and people who have listened to my podcast will know that most of the encouraging, most of the inspiration isn't coming from me. It's coming from the guests that I have on, but I'm able to facilitate that interaction that guest is able to have with that listener. I'm there to make that happen, right? And so understanding your role in life, understanding your purpose and what God has for you, I think it's so vital. And having goals in life is important, but the goals shouldn't necessarily be only numerical. You need to have goals that are attainable and goals that will keep you focused each and every day for growth.
Yeah. Well, Greg, as we begin to bring it to a close here and wrap up, I'm curious, and by the way, this is a line that you use on your podcast, so I'm going to use it here. Normally I'll ask a variety of questions, but what's a final word of advice that you'd like to leave with our listeners today?
I think I stole that one originally from Adam. So I think he did it, but I rephrased it. I called it a closing word. I don't know if he called it final thought. I can't remember exactly how he phrased it, but I stole that from him. And then I've got my go-to that I ask everybody, what is it that drives you? That's a staple for my conversations. But, a parting thought.
Well, I'll let that one slip by, but we'll stick with the final word of advice.
Well, one of my favorite verses is Romans 12. It says, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercy of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. That's what's reasonable for us, right? That's not something that you're special because you're making yourself available. You're not like a unique child of God, because I don't see myself that way. I don't see myself as I guess unique's the wrong word, but something is unattainable. Of course, it's clearly attainable, right? All these men and women of God that I've interviewed over the last 3 years or so, they didn't start out as angels, right? They didn't start out as a pastor of 1,000. They didn't start out as a missionary, but it was the gradual growth over time. It was the gradual change that they allowed God to take place in their life that led them to the point where they're at. And that's so vital that we understand that as leaders, as aspiring leaders, that this isn't going to happen in one moment. You're not going to be so-and-so, and then the next day you're preaching general conference. There's going to be a gradual growth that takes place throughout your life, and being willing to be that living sacrifice that every day you're waking up. This is one thing I like to share at POCC where I pastor. It's like, we look at the will of God, we look at the purpose of God as like this overarching thing. And that's important to have an overarching view of where God wants you and where God's leading you. But we should also look at it as, what is the purpose and the will of God for me today? And if I respond the right way each and every day to that, over time, I'm going to be able to fulfill that ultimate purpose that He has for me. But what's your reasonable service today? What is it that you can do today that's going to be an opportunity for you to share the love of God, to share the gospel with someone, to be an encouragement? And over time, you're going to get to where God wants you to go. But you gotta respond to that every day. Someone who, like Brother Bernard, he didn't get all the knowledge that he got just by saying, I'm answering the call of God, and then the next day he knows all these things. No, it was a gradual process over time, and he's continuing to do that, right? So I think that would be my parting word for somebody, is that don't focus on just the will of God for your overall life. Yes, we need to try and ascertain that. We want to have purpose, a purpose that drives our life. But we should also break it down to each and every day. Okay, what is my purpose for today? God, what do you have for me? What is your will for me today? I'm here. I'm a living sacrifice. I'm making myself available, not because I'm a special Christian, but because this is what God says is reasonable. This is what He says I should do as a Christian.
I love that, Greg. Each and every day we need growth in our life. We're not going to go from hero to zero or zero to hero overnight. It's going to take a gradual day by day growth to move into what the Lord desires for our life ultimately. So, Greg, this has been a tremendous, tremendous conversation. Thank you so much for giving us your time today. If people want to connect with you online, or they want to listen to your podcast, the Hacka Podcast, where can they find you? I know they can just Google the Hacka Podcast, but any other direction that you'd want to give people? Well, before I go into that, I just want to thank you again for this opportunity, Ryan. It's been a privilege of mine. I'm a listener to your show, and as I said, our growth groups that we have here at POS, we love to tune in to the conversations that you have, and so very grateful to have this opportunity to speak to your audience. If you guys want to continue to follow me, I would say just connect to the podcast. My personal page is boring. You're not going to learn much there. You're just going to see me sharing stuff about a POCC, and maybe every once in a while my kids, but that's pretty rare. So follow the pod. You can find us anywhere. We're on Spotify. We're on Apple, YouTube as well.
YouTube's interesting because we post unique clips there that you're not going to find in the other areas. So that might be a good place to look as well. And then obviously on socials, we're on Facebook, Instagram. We are on TikTok, but rarely post. I've got a love-hate relationship with that app. So I know people are there and I want to reach them, not necessarily to grow the podcast, but just to minister to them. But then it's also TikTok. So. But yeah, we are there, and it's the Hacka Pod. You can find it everywhere.
Okay. Awesome. Well, I'll put some links in the show notes for everyone. And this concludes our show today. My name is Ryan Franklin. Thank you so much for joining us on the Christian Leader Made Simple podcast.